It's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off front page is loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 43 podcast. I'm Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and will support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber or follower on Substack, or provide one-time financial support on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. So welcome everybody, all my previous listeners and followers. Thank you for joining once again, and welcome to all my new subscribers and followers. I'm also on Podbean now, which actually has netted a total of 0 views. So not a spectacular start on something that they've advertised so heavily, but we're on it. So we'll see what happens. Okay, I'm going over the 3 articles this week, the main articles. Again, for all new subscribers, I do new articles on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with the text articles and a short video summary on those days. And then I do an audio file and a full video, which is basically just lifting the article and making it into a video. And that's I provide it on Substack, YouTube, and Locals, and Rumble for people that prefer to get video content over reading or audio content. All right, so the 3 articles this week was Russian gas contracts end in Ukraine, President Macron's New Year's speech align U.S. and French interests in 2025, and nuclear warfare policy, Cold War to today, part 5. Okay. So the first one was Russian gas contracts end in Ukraine. And this comes as a shock to many people. But Ukraine was still carrying gas across Russian gas all across its country. If you look at a map of it, it's got gas pipelines crisscrossing all over the country, coming from predominantly Russia, and I think there's 2 coming from Belarus, that crisscross throughout the country, going to locations in Europe and some mainly in Europe, but I think there's some port facilities as well. So Ukraine is carrying Russian gas. Now, countries like Slovakia and Hungary have exemptions from sanctions to be able to purchase Russian gas to maintain their energy infrastructures, and again, the EU approved that for both those countries to approve sanctions against Russia. And then there's also options where European countries can still buy Russian gas within, I think, fixed price limits, but I don't know what the price is, just like oil. And there is my understanding, the way the sanctions regime works, is that you can receive the Russian gas, but you cannot resell it. So there are some limitations, but the fact is that Ukraine, who is at war with Russia, is honoring Russian gas contracts to be able to transport Russian gas, and Russia's getting paid for this gas, which is being used to fund its war machine against the very same war. So it's just amazing that Ukraine felt honor-bound to support these Russian gas contracts. The gas contracts did end on January 1st with no renewal, so Ukraine has stopped transporting Russian gas. So it's not like Ukraine was they weren't predisposed to keep carrying Russian gas after the gas contracts. When their legal obligation ended, they cut off the transfer of Russian gas. Now, they were able to do some other things. When Slovakia made them mad, they had to do some type of modification where Slovakia bought the gas prior to it being put onto the pipelines. So it wasn't it was Slovakian gas from Russia passing through Ukraine and going to Slovakia. So it was just a sleight of hand type arrangement. But now it's cut off. There's no more gas transfer in Ukraine. So it really is a head scratcher of why Ukraine felt honor bound to transport Russian gas. Now, was it a question of, is this to continue to support Europe in its energy crunch, where it was still receiving, obviously scaled back, but was still receiving levels of Russian gas, and in return sending euros or however the gas contracts were written for Russia. So Europe was still sending payments to Russia. And the Ukrainians were transferring this gas, Russian gas, to Europe. So it's a real head scratcher. Like, why is this allowed to exist when the West creates all these sanction regimes, retaliatory sanctions against weakening Russia, but they still allow gas and oil to be traded? They put restrictions on it, but they know they've talked a lot lately about the shadow fleet, especially when the shadow fleet's been dragging anchors and cutting power cables and data lines in the Baltic. Excuse me. But they know the shadow fleet exists, but haven't really done anything about it. They let Russian gas to be sold. They let Russian oil to be sold on the world market. And many countries in Europe, especially Germany, is dependent on that cheap Russian gas as Germany offshores its energy production to Russia. Now, that has changed, but they are still receiving Russian gas, but again, not near at the levels. And the result is, especially when these pipelines were cut off, is the price of energy skyrocketed in Europe, mainly in Germany, significantly in Germany. So again, it just feels, I've talked about this before, the half-hearted implementations of sanctions, that the West is trying to punish Russia, but they're still sending energy production, or they're still purchasing Russian gas and oil, and they have forced Russia to transfer the direction, maybe going less, and they've signed some contracts with China and less so with India. But instead of transferring Russian gas, the Russians, instead of going from east to west, now it's going from Russia back east towards Asia. So again, these energy products are what we call fungible in the economic world. Is that it doesn't matter, is there's just a pie of gas. So what happens is they start transferring gas to India and mainly China. And they've stopped purchasing their gas from somewhere else, which means it's just displaced the energy market, but hasn't really cut that much into the energy market. It has cut some. Russians aren't making as much as they used to, but they're still making a sizable amount. And as gas and energy goes up, oil, Russia makes more off the same amount that they're selling. But the idea of fungible product is there's only so much energy that China can take. So if they were buying, prior to the war, 50% of their gas from Russia, and then they increased it to 75, that other 25% they were getting from elsewhere now is freed up on the market, and the direction that gas would normally flow in China, now it starts flowing into Europe. Now there is disruption in the transfers. That it was very cheap for the Europeans to receive Russian gas because it was on pipelines, but now you have to use ships to get this to, because the Russian pipelines are gone. There's no ships or no pipelines from the U.S. and Canada to Europe. Same with coming from Saudi Arabia or the Gulf region. So these have to go on ships. It's a more expensive way to transfer energy. So again, the relative cost of energy goes up, but the amount of energy that's being consumed on the market did not just increase because the Russians moved their gas going over to the Chinese side. So again, the same amount of gas was put on there. So the question is, and I've talked about this before, mainly with oil, but it applies the same with gas, is that the half-hearted measures of sanctions. The Western powers and the U.S., of course, that's a Western power, Western Europe, and the United States, um, they did not want to see the price of energy skyrocket in their societies because, again, these are still functioning democracies, so they have to still maintain popular vote. And if they keep too much pressure on the population because of skyrocketing energy prices, they will start losing support. You can sit there and say, look at Germany with Olaf Scholz. Chancellor Scholz has to come up for re-election coming up, I think, in February or March. And the crunch of energy has cost Germany significantly. But the fact is that if they want to do sanction regimes, they cannot do half-hearted measures. If the Western countries were really serious about this and wanted to end the war, knowing that Russia is a commodity-based economy, especially now after the war started, where they've had a rush of talent leave Russia to avoid the war. It's a commodity-based economy, mainly in oil and gas. If you wanted to starve the Russia of energy, is you would have to sanction the gas completely and be willing to take it off the market. Now, this would mean the case is that the number of energy studies I've read from a couple of people on Substack is it would take a little bit of time, or take some time, but within the time frame of the war, is the U.S. and Canada, if they were willing to loosen their regulatory regime, they would be able to pump more gas and oil to be able to provide what was lost by Russia. But they didn't want to do that. They wanted to have their regulation, their favorable policy towards the environment, very much committed to the green energy. So even though the West was supporting Ukraine in this war against Russia, they were still allowing gas and oil to be purchased, Russian gas and oil to be purchased on the world market, including in Europe. So it's one of those things, it's like they wanted to have their war, but they didn't want to have their populations suffer the effects of their political decisions. So they allow Russian oil and gas to be sold on the world market. Now, if they really went to a really hardcore energy embargo against Russian energy, that would not have stopped countries like China and probably India from purchasing Russian oil and gas. But it would have meant that the Russians or the Chinese and the Indians would not have been able, even though they're the two most populous countries, they would not have been able to pick up the amount of energy that was being sold in the West. Plus, the West could put economic pressure on both India and China to limit their selling of Russian oil. But they did not do that. They let it be sold on the world market, try to limit the impact to their populations of the energy crunch. And it just felt like they're trying to reform war into something that you just don't, the general populations don't feel the effects of the war. If they're making a war-like policy, again, Europe is not at war with Russia, but they are supporting Ukraine and they are implementing the sanction regime. If they were really serious about really using economic pressure to get Russia to change their mind, they would have gone to a full energy embargo against Russia to try to cut them off and try to starve their economy of the resources it needed to continue its war. But they didn't do that. So it's just, again, absolute head scratcher. And then it goes into even more so, is the energy infrastructure of Ukraine has been attacked relentlessly by the Russians to try to make it as hard as possible on the Ukrainian population. Now, the Ukrainians are striking back a little bit against Russian energy facilities. And in fact, I think a refinery in Belgorod, I think, is still on fire from an attack on by Ukrainian drones and I think longer range ordinances that have been allowed by the West. So Ukraine is kind of attacking back, but the Gulf states have been helping negotiate some of these prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine have put pressure on the Ukrainians not to attack energy production of the Russians, and the administration as well in the U.S. has also put the same pressure on the Ukrainians not to attack Russian energy sources. But the Russians are attacking Ukrainian resources relentlessly, mainly the infrastructure and the production facilities outside the nuclear facilities. They've been pretty much hands off of those. They're occupying the area, but they're not doing anything like attacking them or anything like that. So so West is putting pressure on the Ukrainians not to attack energy sources, along with some of the Gulf states, the OPEC, some of the OPEC nations. The Russians are attacking Ukrainian energy sources and infrastructure. The West is also allowing Russia to sell energy on the world market at a reduced rate, slightly reduced rate, and at a fixed price, especially for oil. But they're still allowing it to be sold, telling the Ukrainians not to attack Russian energy sources because they're benefiting from those energy sources, while at the same time, the Russians are attacking the infrastructure of the energy infrastructure of the Ukrainians, except they're not attacking their own pipelines that run their energy to Europe. So you're just really questioning your mind. It's like, what is this half-hearted measure of sanctions? And then go on top of all this is the Slovakians, who have generally been more, especially after the election of their current prime minister, Fico or Fico, I think it's Fico. At least that's the English pronunciation of it. So Slovakia has been producing energy, excess energy, surplus energy, and it produces energy through gas-fired plants, oil-based plants, and nuclear energy. They're producing a surplus amount of energy, and they're reselling it to the Ukrainians because their infrastructure has been so damaged. The Slovakians are providing excess energy, to that surplus energy. They're selling it to Ukraine to help maintain their function. They're trying to keep their economy functional, also be able to provide the energy and services that the Ukrainian people need. Well, Slovakia, because again, they do have that exemption from the European Union to be able to continue to buy unhindered Russian gas and oil. Their energy, that surplus energy that they're selling back to Ukraine, is using Russian gas, Russian oil, and the nuclear fuel that's used in Slovak nuclear reactors is refined by the Russians. So the Slovakians, and they're not doing anything wrong. They're following within the EU rules that were given to them. So they're not doing anything wrong by doing this, but it's just the ridiculousness of what this war has turned into. Is they are getting energy products, the raw energy sources from Russia in the form of gas, enriched uranium, and oil, converting that to electrical power and reselling the excess surplus energy back to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians, up to January 1st, were allowing the sale of Russian oil, gas, on those pipelines back to Europe. So it's just amazing that the fact is that this has been allowed to go on. This war has been going on since February 2022, and this has been going on. So all of a sudden, those gas contracts get canceled or they expire, and the Ukrainians are fine not supporting them. Of course, the Russians are bellowing about it, and the cost of energy just spiked in Europe. But just the fact is, this has been going on all this time, and the only reason why the Ukrainians were allowing these gas contracts to be fulfilled is because of contractual obligations. They felt obligated to a country that they were at war with to support these contractual obligations to Russia. And it wasn't for some moral support of the Europeans from the Ukrainian side, because as soon as those gas contracts expired, the Ukrainians don't want to renew them. They didn't renew them, and they've stopped the flow of Russian gas. So it's not like they had some moral objection of allowing this energy to, or I guess it was probably a moral objection. They have a moral objection allowing this gas to flow through. And the only reason they felt like they had to do it was because of these contracts. But wouldn't you, if you're at war with a country that's trying to destroy you, doesn't that basically make those contracts null and void, even if they're with a private industry? It's just amazing that this is allowed to happen. This is the sanction regime that has been produced that's been allowed to go on. So it's like, this feels really half-hearted, and it feels like there's a lot of politics at play in this on the Western side, but it also just feels like they're just absolutely not serious about this war. And I wrote earlier today, it'll be released this week, about some of the Ukrainian policies that, again, talking about having no real war aims. And this is just an example, it's almost like pre-World War I type warfare, where professional armies fought the war, but it wasn't total warfare. So the populations just could try to continue going on as if nothing's happening, even though their countries were at war. Or even what U.S. General during the Civil War, Tecumseh Sherman, said, where he made the statement that you can't reform war. And this feels like what they're trying to do. They're trying to reform war. They're trying to remove all the unpleasantness, at least on the Western European side, and the Central Europeans included in this, where they're trying to remove all the unpleasant aspects of fighting a total war. And as a result, this war has been allowed to continue to go on. If they actually went to a full sanction regime and embargoed Russian energy, would the Russians have been able to continue this war? Would the Chinese have been willing, with the other sanctions going on, would they have been willing to blatantly support the Russian economy, even though they have their own economic issues? So would the Russian war machine go on? And would the Western populations be willing to continue to have this war go on, considering that they're paying the pain of what this war means? So it seems like if they did this, they would have actually have shortened the duration of the war, because the desire to keep fighting it would have been, the cost of continuing to fight it would have become much higher. And so it just, again, a half measure where, yep, we're mad at you, but we're going to still buy your energy. The Russians are still willing to sell it because they're getting money in return to be able to continue the war machine. And in the process, Ukrainians are being killed over it. And this is people that have nothing, usually Ukrainians have nothing to do with the war. So it's just amazing that this has been allowed to continue. And now that it's been cut off, we'll see how this war changes. Plus, you have a new administration coming in the U.S. with, and we'll talk about that here in just the next paper. But it's just amazing that energy was allowed to be transferred all throughout this war across Ukraine, just because there was contracts involved. What did the Ukrainian government care about contracts? And that's the answer we don't have. And it's probably an answer you're not going to like. I know I wouldn't like it, because you can speculate the reason for it. I don't want to do that now because I don't really have proof on it. But again, there might be legitimate reasons for this. I cannot imagine what it is, especially if you're committed to the idea of a war and having a true war aim of what victory really is. For I'm not talking about the Ukrainians; they've still spelled out before what their victory requirements are. But what's the What does victory look like for the West? Because it looks like this sanction regime is just spinning wheels and just hope, just support the Ukrainians just enough that not give enough pain or not have produce pain to their population so that they can continue to this war, continue to support this war with no real war aims of what victory looks like. Short of the short of the Russians just quitting the war. So it's just an amazing fact that this has even been able to happen, and it doesn't cause any outrage. It's just, it's actually kind of dumbfounding in this. And it's like, if you're committed to the idea of total war, and this fact is they've talked about the West is allowing their weapons to strike targets in Russia. If you're committed to the idea of total war, do total war. Don't try to reform it into something it's not, because the only thing that's happening is the war's being extended artificially because the West is allowing a lifeline to keep the Russian economy going so they can continue to fight in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are receiving just enough weapons. I'm not talking about expanding the war, but they're just receiving enough weapons to keep inside the war. It doesn't really look like there's any real victory except just to keep it going. And at some point, again, I'll write more about this tomorrow, or you read more about it tomorrow, is the Ukrainians don't have the ability to continue on forever. They just don't have the resources to do that. And so it was just, it's just absolutely dumbfounding that it would have been different as if, okay, the energy contracts expired, the Ukrainians still allow Russian gas to be transferred. It's like, okay, well, you're continuing to support the Europeans. No, as soon as they expired, they cut it off. And it's so you're honoring a contract. You felt obligated to honor a contract. Again, the deeper you go and ask the questions that aren't even being asked by the media or other politicians is, why was this allowed to go on? So anyway, go to the next paper. President Macron's New Year's speech, the alignment of U.S. and French interests in 2025. So this was just a typical New Year's speech last week by French President Emmanuel Macron. And he talked about many different aspects of the world opinion. A lot of it, you go into a point of turmoil. France has got their government has collapsed in their equivalent of their legislature. Germany has elections set for this year, and it doesn't look like Chancellor Scholz is in a particularly good position to maintain power. Justin Trudeau, Canada's longtime prime minister, has announced his resignation. And as head of the Liberal Party, he's still prime minister, but he will not be for too much longer. Japan's Shigeru Ishiba is struggling to form a government. South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol is trying to dodge arrest warrants. So this is what we're leading into 2025 in this coalition of countries that make up the West. Many of them, in fact, everyone I've named off this list is a supporter of Ukraine in its war to various levels. So Emmanuel Macron delivers his speech, and again, it's a wide-ranging speech, and it's just demonstrating his confidence in leading France, which is funny because I think at one point of the Yellow Vest protests, he had an approval rating of 3%, but he still managed to get reelected with a 3% approval rating. Of course, it improved as much as he got closer to the election, so it wasn't 3% approval after the election. And he's positioning himself, and this started in late 2023, to position himself as the influential leader of a unified Europe. Think of European Union. And he's talked about France playing an expanded role in directing the European Union. One of the things that have been a pushback of Macron, and something that's been bothering him, it's a very Gaulish type view. I mean, Charles de Gaulle he is irritated, and he doesn't hide it, is that the most powerful and influential country inside European politics, European as a whole, is the United States. Not a European country is not the most influential country in Europe, and that's something that irritates him. And he's talked about a way to try to de-emphasize or reduce the American influence, either through the U.S. leaving Europe or much smaller footprint, not saying leaving NATO, but a much smaller footprint in Europe, or the Europeans building up their militaries and their defense and their political infrastructure to such an extent, either in conjunction with the U.S. leaving or while the U.S. is leaving, basically increasing the influence of the Europeans to be able to support themselves. And that's mainly focused on national defense, something that has come up during the Ukraine war. It's actually convinced not all, but most of NATO countries to finally, after 10 years, to agree to paying 2% of their GDP towards national defense, something they agreed on 10 years ago. And it's not still, entire countries are not every NATO country is paying up or has, or even on target to meet it, but a vast majority are paying that now, finally, which had to happen just in 2024. So President Macron, under that backdrop, is the idea is that he does not want to see U.S. influence. He would like to see a decrease in U.S. influence. He certainly does not want to see U.S. influence increase. And you can see how that aligns with President-elect Trump's view of making the Europeans pay more for their own defense. So in this case, Macron and President-elect Trump are very aligned on the role of the Europeans assuming more responsibility for their own defense. So again, this is something that President Macron has pushed for, oftentimes at the detriment and criticism of the United States, to try to push the idea that Europe needs to be for Europe, all the way to the point that Europe needs to stop buying U.S. weapons and start producing their own weapons. France has their own significant industry, so I'm sure they're pushing their view of it. And again, not being so reliant on the U.S. Also, if the U.S. has a less military footprint in Europe, the less influential they will be. Now, there's a lot of countries inside Europe that still take lead from the Americans. If the Americans reduce their footprint, both militarily and politically in Europe, these countries that align closely with the U.S. trying to curry favor, or in the case of some countries in Central Europe where they expect the United States to be the primary guarantor of their defense, these countries, if the U.S. is gone, they're going to have to start paying up for their own defense and not be reliant on the U.S. So maybe they would start looking more from the European perspective and instead of what the U.S. interests are. Now, I'm not promoting this idea, but I understand what they're going for at this point. And I think there is certainly something to be said that the Europeans need to be more responsible for their own defense. Well, this is something President Macron has been pushing for since 2023, late 2023. So this aligns very closely to what he wants. So at this point, President-elect Trump and President Macron are very much aligned at the idea of reducing the U.S. presence in Europe. Now, the alignment is coming from the fact that and President Macron has signed on to, he invited President-elect Trump to the reopening of the Notre Dame Cathedral, and he met with him at the French presidential palace, along with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. And you see a tone change in the Europeans, mainly led by the French in this case, and by the Ukrainians, where um, they are actually willing to talk about peace, where the Ukrainians are opening up to the idea of a land for security type peace deal. And the President Macron has very much embraced to this particular formula. Now, the formula at a high level, and again, the Russians haven't agreed to it. They haven't. There's still a lot of hurdles on that, and that's what retired U.S. Army General Keith Kellogg is the point person for the President-elect Trump on finding a way forward in a peace process. The general outline of the peace process that President Macron and President-elect Trump and President Zelensky, seem to be aligned to is the idea is, and this is how it goes, is that the United States needs to have free latitude to convince the Russians to come to the bargaining table to end the war. The Europeans are there to provide the security to the Ukrainians, which is something the Ukrainians have asked for since the 1994 Budapest memorandum. So the peace deal that's being looked at or being proposed, again, the Russians haven't accepted it, and it's just a high level plan. But again, it's getting traction with the French, the Polish, and the Ukrainians. That's primarily important that the Ukrainians sign on to this, and I'll talk about that here in just a moment. So they are actually willing to, at this point, the Ukrainians have been holding on to the fact is that they will not even negotiate with the Russians until the Russians leave, or the Ukrainians take back every bit of Ukrainian territory. They have actually started moving away from that because, again, it's unrealistic. And again, I'll have a paper tomorrow about it. A short paper, but a little bit more about this tomorrow. So feel free to look for that in Substack tomorrow. So again, the outline is that the U.S. will convince the Russians to come to the negotiating table. And then at that point, the U.S. will be in the background of providing support, material support as needed to the Ukrainians, mainly in the area of weapons production, but also support to the Europeans. The Europeans would take the lead on providing a peacekeeping force inside Ukraine. And these would be basically, the negotiations of how this looks like, again, have to be going back and forth, is these European troops would be there to prevent the Russians from moving again into Ukraine. If the Russians attack these European troops, now they would be probably from NATO countries, but they would not be protected under Article 5 in NATO. So they would be NATO countries, but acting outside of NATO and NATO protections. But if NATO agrees to it, you'll probably see a NATO unified command structure without the Article 5 requirements. If the Russians attack those European troops, and again, it would not be U.S. troops in Ukraine, it would be European troops in Ukraine, you would see most likely the Europeans and NATO find some way to get involved in the war. It's hard to believe that Poland, France, Great Britain would accept the Russians attacking their troops and then them not reacting through some type of armed conflict with the Russians. And the Russians would know that. And if it turns around and NATO gets dragged in, the U.S. is going to be dragged in. So that's what the security idea comes from, is that if you attack these European troops, you're going to lead into a wider European war, which would not go over well for the Russians unless it escalates into a nuclear type conflict. So that's where the security comes from. And that's what's basically being advocated by the President-elect Trump, led by General Kellogg, and Macron is signing on to this. And as soon as he had that meeting in Notre Dame with President-elect Trump and President Zelensky, he flew to Poland to try to get the Polish to sign on to this. Now, the Polish haven't signed on to it yet, but they said they didn't see the idea that their troops could be operating inside of Ukraine for at least 6 months, which kind of matches into what, some type of negotiation would happen. So it comes up to cases that the U.S. and French short-term goals seem to be very much aligned. And actually, when you look at maybe midterm and long-term goals, is the U.S. peace formula where the Europeans take the lead, and then the Europeans take the lead in their own security. And this is something that President Macron has argued for since 2023, and it aligns pretty closely to statements from even the first Trump administration of Europeans paying more for their own defense. And so this seems like France and the U.S. are very much aligned on the same direction of where to go. Now, is the rest of Europe signed on to have a French leadership in Europe, or a French vision of what a unified Europe looks like? That's still to be determined. Would the Germans sign on for that? Would the British would sign on to it? The Italians? That's unclear. Germany is still the biggest economy in Europe and has the most economic potential in the European Union. So would they be willing to take back seat to the French? That still has to be decided. But Macron doesn't necessarily have to say it has to be French leadership, but I know that's what he intends. I think just about everybody sees it. But would a unified Europe, what would it look like without U.S. leadership? And would it even be possible? Would the Polish and the Germans actually agree to such a idea of diminished U.S. presence and guarantees that it's provided since World War II, since the end of World War II? Would they be willing to let that go? But again, it does seem like President Macron and President-elect Trump are very much aligned, and they've gotten President Zelensky of Ukraine to align very closely to this position. So I would say that I also added that President Macron of France, I have a lot to say about him, but I would say that he's not acting dishonestly or selfishly. He's considering France's long-term self-interests. And President-elect Trump said this, and even in his first term, he talked about he expects, his view is America first, but he also has the consideration that leaders of their own countries have to think about the self-interest of their own countries and treat them as first. So it seems like, again, there seems like be a lot of alignment between Macron and President-elect Trump. And they used to butt heads a lot in the first administration, but at this point, they seem to have reached some type of consensus for ending the war and creating a future European structure for security, for long-term security, including Ukrainian security, which could, again, this also includes building up the European defense industry. And the view is that also that would include using Ukraine to be a weapons producer, which would also help the Ukrainians' armed forces by able to provide more weapons material to be produced inside Ukraine itself. Though, of course, they would also be, if another war started with European troops there, obviously those factories would be targets for Russian assaults. But if that ever happened, it's a wider European war. So interesting point of view of how French and President-elect Trump and President Zelensky are changing the landscape of how the future of the war in Ukraine is looking and how it's going to end. Where before it just didn't seem like there was any end in sight. And President Macron talked about this, about some of the paradigm shifts of what this has done. It's opened up possibilities that were closed before just because willing to engage in types of negotiations that the other leaders were not willing to do. So, excuse me. So, interesting to see how this goes. It does seem like this is an agreed upon formula for peace. It's just a matter of how do you get the Russians to agree to it. Again, I'll talk a little bit about that more tomorrow. Please feel free to read that paper. It's one of the smaller papers, so it'll be relatively short, about 700 words. So it's not a long read. All right, so next I'm going into part 5 of my nuclear war policy, Cold War to today, talking a lot about the nuclear policy. The previous focuses of the other parts have been about PD introduction, and my last three parts were about PD 59, Presidential Directive 59. Now, this week is not necessarily about PD 59, but it's a document that was mentioned in PD 59, which was under President Carter in July 1980. So part of what was mentioned inside the PD 59 was something called PD 41, which was signed in September 29, 1978. Now, there, you read this paper, you're going to see interlacing descriptions of NSC memos, memorandums, documents, directives, and it's just cutting back from the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, the Carter administration. It's just this crisscross mishmash reading. Okay, you read this document, it refers back to PD 59, goes to PD 41. PD 41 says go to NSC 32. NSC 32 says go to NSSM something or other. I can't remember the names of it. So you're just going around this mishmash, crisscross thing. But what's talking about civil defense policy. Okay, so you think, what does civil defense policy have to do with nuclear warfare policy? Now, bear with me on this one. All right, so nuclear equivalency and mutually assured destruction. Prior to the introduction of the idea, the concept of limited nuclear war, which was somewhat started formulating in the as early as the late 60s and was pushing through, but President Carter really did a lot more formalization into the idea of limited nuclear war as part of U.S. nuclear policy. The Soviets obviously were doing the same thing as well. And part of it is nuclear equivalency, mutually assured destruction. Even though they were creating these concepts of limited nuclear war and not this general nuclear war and this full nuclear exchange, or the nuclear spasm is what we call it, where basically everybody shot everything they had off and tried to destroy each other. Well, the idea of mutually assured destruction was that ultimately, why would you want to commit a nuclear attack when the ultimate response is that there would be such a nuclear exchange from the U.S. or the Soviet Union, depending on whoever struck first, is your populations would be destroyed, your population, your infrastructure, your key industries, natural resources, all the things that make a government would be destroyed. So it doesn't matter. It's like, even if you win, your whole society is destroyed. So win is in quotation marks because there's no winner in the idea of mutually assured destruction. That was the deterrence, is you're not going to use a nuclear attack or try to destroy another country. If you don't, ultimately, if you go too far, your whole society will be destroyed, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing that can stop it. There's no ABM system even today that could stop a full nuclear exchange when you're talking about both countries had 50,000 plus nuclear weapons between the two of them, roughly 25,000 apiece, which is an important part I talked about earlier about the idea of nuclear equivalency, that they basically had to stay close, both sides had to stay relatively balanced with the same number of nuclear warheads. Because if you got out of balance, that means that the idea of your deterrent effect starts getting out of balance. Well, if deterrent effects get out of bounds or out of balance, that means that it opens up the aspect of winning a nuclear war. Maybe the other side will have more destruction to their society than you had on your society. So we win, quotation marks again, in that type of scenario. So the number of warheads being relatively matched was an important part, and it became critical is if one side started creating more warheads and started getting a little bit ahead, that would be a area of crisis because it could break the idea of mutually assured destruction. Again, remember, the idea of mutually assured destruction is destroy the country's population and their critical, or not even their critical infrastructure, all their infrastructure and economics that make a society a society. You need people, you need infrastructure. So even if the government somehow survives, but their whole population is wiped out, can they really lead? Can they lead from their bunker inside Moscow or up in the foothills of West Virginia if everything else has been destroyed? No, you basically have lost. It doesn't matter. You can be in a bunker of 5 people and you're somehow in charge of a country that's destroyed. That's not really a country. Basically, the idea is you have to have a functioning society, or even something like a society in general, to be in power. And the idea is that mutually assured destruction held that population, those people, those infrastructure, all the things that make a society a society, were threatened by the idea of nuclear destruction. Again, that's mutually assured destruction. So basically, everything that made that country a country are held hostage to each other. So, for example, even if the Soviets did a first strike and they destroyed all the American ICBMs before they ever launched, that doesn't mean that they didn't stop the bombers and they didn't stop the invulnerable submarines, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, of a retaliatory strike that could destroy the whole Soviet population, because those submarines were basically invulnerable to the Russians stopping them. You couldn't just drop a nuke on the nuclear submarine because you don't know where it's at. So these submarines, again, they look big, but when you comparison to the ocean, they're very small. And even when they have patrol zones, those patrol zones are relatively big. Very, very hard, almost impossible to find a silent submarine that lurks just below the surface, waiting to unleash its nuclear weapons to destroy a population. So that's what mutually assured destruction was. You destroy everything that's important, that makes a society a society. So that's what keeps you from doing that, because you know that you'll lose everything. Even if you destroy let's say the United States, you destroy the United States, you will lose everything in response. And that's what the idea of mutually assured destruction. And so that was the deterrent effect of mutually assured destruction. But if that population is what is being held hostage, what if you could save that population and they can come out of the holes after the nuclear exchange or wherever they were displaced to, and come back up, and all of a sudden you still have a population that wins? So the idea is that if you could save your civilian population from that nuclear destruction or being held hostage to what's called a counter value attack or part of mutually assured destruction, all of a sudden it becomes possible is that, yeah, I could save my population, I could destroy the other guy's population, and I will come out as, quote, the winner. So civil defense was being viewed as something of a way of serving 2 purposes. It's basically telling us that the governments of these countries are committed to the idea of saving their populations or protecting their populations in case of a nuclear attack. And the other was to create a situation back to, that could be communicated back to the Soviets and Soviets back to the Americans, is we can save our population. And so that starts creating questions. If you can save your population, you are deteriorating the deterrent effect of counter value targeting or mutually assured destruction. Again, in case you want, counter value is attacking the infrastructure and the population, often sometimes called city busting, is one of the common terms for it, but it actually extends beyond that. But it's primarily major cities, destroy the major cities and the populations, all the things that make the country country. So the idea is that if you can save this population, you can start eroding the deterrent effect, which would create a crisis inside the other country that sees that maybe they can't save their populations. So we talked about it a little bit. So that's what civil defense is. It's basically communicating to your civilian population, that we are committed to protecting you. Even if you look at budgets, they're really not. But they say, stick with us. We're going to save you. We're here to protect you. Excuse me. And the other one is protecting or communicating, trying to create a concern or an erosion of deterrent effect on the opposing side. So again, July 1980, President Carter updated his U.S. strategic nuclear targeting doctrine, both pre-planned through the PSYOP and creating several organizations that allow for more, we'll call it on-the-fly type, non-pre-planned nuclear options, attack options. Again, some of it's about limited nuclear war. Some of it's also looking at counter value, idea of reserve nuclear forces, all that. So part of it was mentioned, and there was PD 41, which was signed on September 29, 1978, and established the fundamental requirements for civil defense programs in the U.S. and the cost effectiveness of safeguarding the population and critical industries in the event of nuclear war. Again, I'm an economist, so the idea is that land, labor, and capital. So if you looking at those are the factors of production, that's the things that make an economy go. Well, counter value targeting goes after your labor and it goes after your capital. So the idea is civil defense was to safeguard the population and critical industries in the event of a nuclear war. So the policy review of this committee was led by the Department of Defense, which was to analyze the strategic implications of civil defense programs in the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The review was to include analysis on the characteristics and capacities of the U.S. and Soviet civil defense programs, doctrines, policies, and objectives of both civil defense programs, the strategic usefulness of current potential U.S. and Soviet civil defense programs, alternative U.S. policy responses to Soviet civil defense, and alternative policies for U.S. civil defense. That's a mouthful. So the idea is that looking at is were the Soviets in the lead when it came to civil defense and protecting their critical industries and population. Now, I'll go into more about this in the next part of this paper. Is part of this is civil defense is obviously population evacuation and the idea of finding ways to protect critical infrastructures by moving them to bomb shelters. For example, the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City in the Cold War period was to operate out of salt mines in, I'm not sure where the city is, but in Kansas, was operating salt mines. And this was something I had seen many, many years ago, decades, I guess, a documentary called War by Quinn Dyer. Again, a very anti-war type person and kind of more on the gloom and doom side, but that does not negate exactly what he was saying on many aspects of what he was talking about nuclear war. Again, I talked about this earlier. He moved from when nuclear war and the gloom and doom of nuclear war, which again, that was legitimate concerns about some of the craziness of the idea of limited nuclear wars and just the idea of just general nuclear war in general, which, okay, I'm on a sidetrack here, but the idea is why I wrote this series is that the ridiculousness of nuclear warfare policy was done and behind us at the end of the Cold War. And we've brought it back to the forefront by our political leaders all over the world and how they've created this new threat of nuclear war. You've got the Russians threatening to, they're changing their nuclear doctrine on what they will attack, which is, you don't even have to have nuclear weapons to face a nuclear attack now, according to their stated doctrine. And again, I've argued that did they really change it, or was that always their policy? And then you've got Chinese, they're talking about continue to build up their ICBM force that they will actually have in the 2030s. They will actually have a larger ICBM force than the United States That doesn't include the Americans' SLBMs, submarine launched ballistic missiles, or the B-21 Raiders that would be available by the time this comes around, but also the B-2s. And the U.S. would be paired off against two major nuclear adversaries in both China and Russia, though the U.S. does have allies in Great Britain and France, but both have much smaller nuclear arsenals than both Russia and China. So this is the ridiculousness of what we have. But back to the idea of civil defense policy was the concern was how is how is the Soviet Union using civil defense to try to protect their strategic infrastructure and their population? Two of the three factors of production. And then also, if you go into land, how good is it if you irradiate through nuclear attacks and then later the subsequent nuclear fallout? So nuclear war disrupts all the factors of economic production. But civil defense, how can it protect your civilian population, call it your labor, and your infrastructure, the things that make your society a society, the things that make the things go, that infrastructure, your capital. So the idea is that you're destroying what makes up a society, both from the military, the moral, and also looking at just from the pure economic perspective. Again, talk about land, labor, and capital. One of my favorite things to talk about this. Everything kind of revolves around that in modern society if you start really looking at it. But okay, that's a sidetrack again. So this is what this was supposed to be at. So the first part of it is, I can't pronounce it. The NSC director for President Carter was, I'm going to butcher his first name, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, he was leading the original studies of NSC 30, of PD 59, and some of the documentations of PD 41, which was prior to that was part of NSC 32. So he prior wrote a memo for a working committee. Again, Department of Defense was leading this strategic study, was looking at the Soviet civil defense program. Now, the Soviets had blast shelters for their top leadership. And actually, I guess I'll do what I did last week. I'll see if I can find this document. Excuse me while you hear papers going around. I should have had this prepared, but I was not prepared to immediately talk about this in this perspective. But I don't think my little scribbles can really do a justification. Okay, here it is. All right. So this is a security memo from the National Security Council signed by Zbigniew Brzezinski. And does it have, it's for NSC. All right. Well, it's signed October 20th, 1970. It's Memorandum 4, Zbigniew Brzezinski. It's from Samuel Huntington. And it's an interagency intelligence memorandum on Soviet defense. And it's a part of a 350-page study, which I have not found all 350 pages of that particular study. But it says, and stated in here is, there's a bunch of, it's a relatively short document, but the Soviets have blast shelters, that means nuclear shelters, for all their top leadership, about 110,000 people, and enough blast shelters for 10 to 20% of their urban population. Now, the one I've read this is the Soviet conditions for saving blast shelters for the urban population was, for the most part, was a subway and train system. So that's where most of the underground facilities for the urban population was available. Okay, so in 3 days, the Soviets could evacuate a bulk of their urban population and reduce their fatalities in a nuclear exchange to less than 20 million and their total casualties to less than 50 million if they were given 3 days' notice prior to a nuclear attack. In 7 days, the Soviets could fully evacuate their major cities and reduce their fatalities to less than 10 million and their total casualties to less than 20 million. Seems like a bargain, right? All right. So it talks about the Soviets have 117,000 full-time defense workers. They have a defense budget of 400 million rubles, the equivalent of $2 billion in 1977 dollars. The U.S. program at that time was only $100 million a year. The Soviets would also have a deputy director of defense, minister of defense leading it, and also a full general as the military head of it. So it goes in here to talk a little bit about more. There's a chart on here. So I'm going to just kind of read it down here through here. Is the Soviet Civil Defense Program focuses primarily on the protection of people, leadership, essential workers, general population, in that order. Other goals are maintenance of economic activity in wartime and post-attack recovery. 2, the pace of the program increased substantially in the late 1960s. Remember, that's when mutually assured destruction started becoming a primary goal. A publicly recognized, highly structured, military-controlled civil defense organization exists at all levels of the Soviet government and economy, headed up by a national organization led by a general of the army and a deputy minister of defense. There are 117,000 full-time Soviet civil defense workers. 4, the 1976 cost of the program is 400 million rubles, or $2 billion. 5, programs for the protection of leadership are well advanced. The Soviets have command post shelters in space for virtually all leadership elements at all levels, a total of 110,000 people. A minimum of 10 to 20% of the total urban population can be presently sheltered, assuming that the continuation of current programs 15 to 30% by 1985. Despite shelter construction, large-scale evacuation from target areas is the key to reduce casualties. 2 to 3 days would be required to evacuate a bulk of the urban population and a week to fully evacuate major cities. While any projections are very uncertain, it is estimated that the U.S. attack of 2,200 weapons will be directed at targets would produce the following results. All right, so I'm going to read this one to you too. All right. So, time preparations, less than 2 hours. That's talking about the launch of 2,200 nuclear weapons with less than 2 hours warning. The fatalities in the Soviet Union will be 50 to 70 million killed, 120 million total casualties. Less than 24, over 50 million, over 100 million total casualties. So in going from 2 hours to 24 hours, they could save estimated 20 million people. 2 to 3 days preparation, 15 to 20 million killed, 50 million total casualties. Over 7 days warning, 5 to 10 million killed, 20 million total fatalities. Basically a reduction of 83% if they are given a week's warning. The Soviets cannot prevent massive industrial damage, a breakdown of their economy, and the destruction of their most significant material accomplishments. And this is certainly true. It is much harder to protect you can't move a factory in a week to be able to protect it. So you have to either disperse it, which means you have to go away from your urban populations because you need that labor. So it's hard for it to disperse the industry that makes a society that's able to do all the things that you need for your economy to do without the labor. So even if you move it, you're going to have to bring the labor with you. And if you can't do that, then you have to have the labor. If you're going to transport the labor, well, all those things will be destroyed. Your labor will be destroyed unless you can evacuate it. So it's not convinced that the Soviets are able to spread out their industry from the people. So, and that makes sense. And so even if they do put a factory, that all of a sudden becomes a major target. And remember, in these targeting doctrines that created this is they had, I think, 40,000 targets, about 25,000 warheads. And so they would start targeting some of these smaller areas, the things that you'd normally not target it. And so diversifying away from the cities was not really an option, because at that point you actually become a city in itself, and then you become a targeting doctrine yourself. They do not have a way to protect again, the breakdown of their economy by the destruction of the most significant material accomplishments and their industrial capacity. So 10, the Soviets have a favorable view of their civil defense organization. They almost certainly believe that their present civilian defense system would improve their ability to conduct military operations and enhance the USSR's chance of survival following a nuclear exchange. This indicates that they have a confidence level that they can save their population. But in 9, they talked about that. So again, this is the U.S. view. 9, the U.S. doesn't think that they can provide the massive industrial damage or break down their economy from an attack of 2,200 nuclear weapons. They're saying, conversely, their view is that the Soviets have a favorable view of their civil defense organization, and they certainly believe that their present civil defense system would improve their ability to conduct military operations and enhance the USSR's chance of survival following a nuclear exchange. That is starting to break down the idea of deterrence, of mutually assured destruction, or counter value targeting. So it doesn't matter what the U.S. view is. Even if the U.S. view is right, if the Soviets think that they can save their population, that's what's going to make their decision, not what the U.S. thinks, or that they're thinking that, no, the Soviets are overestimating their ability to protect their population. It doesn't matter what the U.S. thinks. It's what the Soviet leadership thinks. And the Soviet leadership, according to the U.S. interpretation, is they are confident in their civil defense organization. It continues, given all the uncertainties involved in a nuclear exchange, they cannot, however, have confidence in the degree of protection their civil defense will provide them. Hence, their current civilian defenses will not embolden them to deliberately expose the USSR to higher risk of nuclear attack. What it's saying there is that even though the Soviet leadership is confident in their civil defense program, they have doubts that it can actually attain this. Now, it seems like you're saying two different things here. Either they have confidence or they don't have confidence. It seems like it's a reassurance. Either they're saying that the Soviet Union has confidence in their civil defense program, which would break down deterrence. But to keep alarm from the audience is that basically saying that, no, deterrence is still in effect, because despite the Soviets having confidence, Soviet leadership having confidence in their civil defense organization, they don't have enough confidence in it to risk risking their whole society over a nuclear exchange. So they're saying in the end, despite their confidence, they don't have enough confidence, and the deterrent effect is still available. 11, there is no reason to believe that their judgment, meaning the Soviet judgment, on the matters of paragraph 10, which I just read above, will change in the foreseeable future. So they're saying that basically in this document, they're saying that the Soviet Union, even with their significant civil defense capability, in both their own opinion and the U.S.'s evaluation, is not enough to change the deterrent effect of mutually assured destruction. Now, there's some interesting things in here, too. Again, I agree that the Soviet Union would not be able to protect their critical infrastructure, as I said before, because even if you diversify out or you distribute out your key industries, you're not going to be able to guarantee them that they not be attacked, because they will in themselves require a large amount of population to support those industries, and then that self, you become a target. You become a major city, a major target for nuclear weapons. Again, you're talking about you have 25,000 nuclear weapons at their disposal in the PSYOP. You have 25,000 nuclear weapons. I think you have to get 40,000 targets. So can't attack anything, but they felt like they would not be able to protect it. Now, the other thing is they talk about that the Soviet Union can save 83% of their population. They're getting a 7-day notice. Now, one of the parts of PD 59 was talking about the idea of a U.S. reserve force. Basically, the reserve force was that in a case of a limited nuclear war, there was always enough nuclear weapons there's enough nuclear weapons that were not going to be used, that are going to be held back for counter value attacks. Hold the population hostage. But how effective, if you start a limited nuclear war and you start doing, whether even if you started city avoidance, but then you talk about countervailing, which would be some limited attacks on cities. Countervailing is basically holding everything that's meant to hold a society together short of destroying that whole society. Basically break down the Soviet leadership without destroying the population was part of countervailing. Countervalue is just going after that population and that critical infrastructure, or not even the critical infrastructure, the economic infrastructure that makes up society. Creating this reserve force, and this reserve force was supposed to be established. So if you launch a limited nuclear war and the Soviet civil defense system starts the evacuation process, that reserve force, again, would not have any civilians, because again, the idea is that they would be dispersed out. Now, there could be a way to attack that population outside of pre-planned targeting. But for the most part, this puts pressure on the U.S. to make a decision on attacking those targets. Are they going to, do you have 7 days to make that decision, or within 7 days to make that decision, knowing that every day that slips by, from the time that you go from a 2-hour notice to over 7 days, 83% of the Soviet population can be removed and safe from the targeting of Soviet cities. So does that mean that even with a limited nuclear war doctrine that you have faced within 7 days, you have to make a decision on whether you're going to use that reserve force for counter value targeting, or do you go into just a flat out nuclear spasm and destroy everything in one shot? Don't have the answer to that, but that's the question, is how effective is that reserve force is if 83% of your population will be saved in 7 days? Does that incentivize to negotiate an end to the war prior to the movement of civilian infrastructure? And I don't have data for this too. Or is it because the Carter and PD 59 set up the idea of pre-planned targeting of the PSYOP, but also opened up is that you had to have some level of flexibility, staff work, and intelligence to be able to form pre-planned targets, basically plan a nuclear attack within a relatively short term. Was the idea that counter value was going to move outside the pre-planned targeting of PSYOP and into nuclear targeting that's formatted on the fly through the intelligence collection? Not sure. Then you can argue that, yeah, it's actually, there is a way to attack the Soviet Union after the 7-day requirement. But that means you have to go outside the pre-planned elements of the PSYOP. Again, I don't have any information on this. I haven't seen anything. I haven't read anything on that. I don't know if it's all classified or it's buried further into the President Ford, Nixon, and Carter libraries. I'm not sure. But it does look like is either you have to get that nuclear exchange, the effects of counter value targeting become less and less important. Again, it doesn't help with your infrastructure, but you could save people, but you had to make that decision within 7 days. Or does the U.S. just say, okay, yeah, we're going to let the population survive, but we're going to destroy all the infrastructure, and then just that people just, I don't know, starve, break down. I don't, you can't think of that. Even if everybody leaves the city, but you destroy the city and all the economic and power infrastructure and the distribution networks, that the whole society, even if you let 83% of the population live, do they really live? Or does nuclear war, nuclear winter, nuclear fallout kill them? It's all unsure. I'm not sure. I don't have enough documentations on this, or I haven't seen enough documentation sit there and address those sufficiently to come up with an answer. I just don't know. But it does tell me, again, just by reading in the common sense and let's look at nuclear side, you have to make a decision within 7 days, or you have to build something in your on the fly, your flexible targeting doctrine. You have to be able to find a way to have an intelligence infrastructure that can identify where these targets are. And they have to be in a large enough area that your counter value targeting of, at the time, we're talking about 1978, 1980, is the submarines did not have precision enough weapons until I think 1990, that these weapons were used for large area targets. They were not meant for targeting specific industries or specific um, um, mobile positions. These were things that had to be, the SLBMs were mainly just for counter value, basically destroy the cities. They couldn't go pick off individual warheads because they weren't considered accurate enough. So even if you have these on-the-fly targeting or this flexible targeting option, would it be in an area big enough that an SLBM could launch that attack? I don't have the answer to that either. But that's something, again, intelligence would have to make that collection, which means that if the Soviets were trying to protect their population from a SLBM attack, even one outside of the 7 days, they would have to disperse that population out wide and far to prevent them from being attacked in whole by the American ballistic missile submarines. Again, I don't have anything on this. I'm just going in there, just reading the documentations and what I know about nuclear war. It's just some of the questions that come up. But the idea is civil defense, if you have an effective civil defense system, it starts breaking down your options of how you attack counter value targeting or that holding that population hostage. Yes, you could attack the infrastructure. There's not a lot of that can be done about the critical industries, but they're arguing that Soviets do have an effective way to protect their population. The other thing is, once you destroy the cities, if you go ahead and decide to destroy the cities, and again, create the nuclear winter, do you have, or in the nuclear fallout, do they have a way to feed all those people? Or can they just get them evacuated and they're pretty much on their own, especially if the cities are go ahead and destroyed without targeting the population? All questions that don't really have the answer on, but it goes into the fact is that a effective civil defense program can break down nuclear deterrence to an extent, but is it enough to prevent the idea of counter value targeting or mutually assured destruction? The U.S. Interpretation of the Soviet capabilities is it does have the possibility, because of the number of people it could save, it does have a possibility of breaking down the deterrent effect, at least when you look at it from the perspective of saving populations. But it was not enough to convince Soviet leadership that they were unwilling to abandon the idea of deterrence because they did not have faith that they could save their society even with their effective civil defense program, which means to me, that means they're uncoupling population from their infrastructure, and their infrastructure is what matters to them. And they're not necessarily wrong, not from the point of matter, but is you had to have land, labor, and capital. And even if you have your capital, you can save your labor, but you destroy your capital if you've lost one of your major factors of production or economic production. So that is what I have for part one, and next article on this topic. Part 6 will be part 2 of a 2-part series on civil defense. So it'll be more of a concentration on the U.S. program and conclusions of that were designated to be reviewed in PD 41 under the PD 59 documentation. So that is what it is today. So there will be more to come on that, but the boring topic of civil defense, but how something like this played into the whole interpretation of total nuclear war or even limited nuclear war. The idea, again, of how do you create deterrence and how do you prevent the other guy from breaking deterrence. So just an interesting aspect of nuclear war and where the civil defense organizations fit into this. So that is it for this week. Thank you for listening. appreciate all my existing listeners and subscribers. I appreciate it. Welcome all the new subscribers. If you're just listening but not a subscriber or follower, please become one. That would be most appreciated. Right now, I do not have paid options like paid content. I've considered it, but I don't really have enough paid subscribers. But if you're willing to at least even give one-time support, that would be greatly appreciated. Again, I'm a relatively low overhead operation, but it does cost money to pull a lot of these documentations and resources. That would be greatly appreciated. It gives me some ability to be able to purchase more type research items and pay for other more in-depth news sites and also news sites that can be translated. There's some good sources out there that are outside of the English language, and I have limited ability to read much outside of English, a limited ability to read German, but need help. So again, I really rely on web source sites that can help, that do translations. And Google Translate is not exactly, it works, but it doesn't get you maybe some of the context that you need. So oftentimes you need an actual way to convert to English language that gets all the context of what's being discussed. So anyway, just saying that it would be greatly helpful if you do be willing and generous to offer support. I also do research for people when they have projects. You can contact me on that as well. Do not contact me if you want me to write your term paper. That is not part of the deal. It's for mainly authors who need research in particular areas or help in researching or even provide opinion. I am available for that. So thank you for listening. I hope all of you have a great week. The holidays, for the most part, are behind us. I think there's still Orthodox Christmas coming up. But now we're in the point of winter has started, except for everybody that's in the Southern Hemisphere. But thank you for joining. I hope all of you have a good week. If you are in the Northern Hemisphere, stay warm. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, enjoy the nice weather. We will talk to you next week. Thank you.